Refining the weighted average cost of capital to a more realistic hurdle rate. In this discussion, we're going to talk about the weighted average cost of capital of a company and how we might actually modify that number to be something that's more realistic for purposes of capital budgeting exercises within the organization. By way of review, we calculate the cost of debt or bonds in a company as the yield of the bonds times 1 minus the tax rate. We calculate the cost of common stock as being the dividend divided by the price and then adding the growth rate to that. And we would quantify the cost of preferred stock as simply dividend divided by price. And as you will recall, we can calculate the weighted average cost of capital for a company by multiplying the cost times the weight of each of these sources and then adding them together. One interesting question is, what number should we actually use when we analyze an investment project? Are all projects the same? Should a company only seek to meet its true cost of capital as a return, or should it try to get something higher? A lot of companies decide to increase or add to their weighted average cost of capital and create a higher number that we refer to as a hurdle rate, so that we can build in some kind of a return for the company when we do things like capital budgeting analysis. Some companies have multiple divisions, and each of those divisions in many cases behave very differently from each other. One example would be a large company such as General Electric that has one division that manufactures aircraft engines and another division that makes light bulbs, or General Motors that had at one time divisions that did financing, divisions that did manufacturing of cars, and a computer technology division. One of the approaches that some companies will take is that they will create a specific cost of capital for each division within their business to use as a foundation for analyzing possible investment projects. We call that the divisional cost of capital approach, and what they try to do is come up with a cost of capital for the division that matches sort of the risk profile and the industry profile of the particular business that division is in. One way that some companies do this is through something called the pure play approach. Take an example. Let's go back to the General Electric example. One of the divisions of General Electric manufactures aircraft engines. So if GE is trying to come up with a cost of capital for their aircraft engine division to use, they might find a company out there that only manufactures aircraft engines. That's all they do. It's the only business they're in. They're what we call a pure play company. And GE can take a look at that company and figure out what that company is using for a cost of capital, and then turn around and use a similar number for its own division that competes in that same business of the aircraft engine manufacturing. A lot of times companies will have divisions that are in very different businesses from each other, and they'll each have their own cost of capital that matches very closely with what pure play companies in that one industry do. And this is just one approach that some people will use, or some companies will use. Another approach to adjusting the cost of capital to match more closely with reality is something called the subjective approach. And this is where sometimes companies will just add a premium on top of the weighted average cost of capital, depending on what the project profile is. For example, if you look here, here's a company that has decided to add 10% to the weighted average cost of capital if you're analyzing projects in a brand new business, something that you've never done before, has higher risk. So in this case, that would mean taking the 10% weighted average cost of capital and adding another 10% to it. So you would use 20% to calculate net present values, and the IRR would have to be higher than 20% when you analyze possible investments. This same company might have a rule that says, okay, if we're doing something that's dealing with an already existing business, then we'll assume that that's got medium risk. And what we'll do is we'll add 5% to the weighted average cost of capital in that case. So you'd have the 10% weighted average cost of capital. And you'd add 5% to that because it's a business that's not terribly risky, because it's an extension maybe of an existing business. So the 15% then becomes the cost of capital number that you would use when you do a net present value analysis of a possible investment. Maybe this same company would say, hey, look, if we're just evaluating a project where we're going to replace existing machinery, we figure that to be very low risk. So we won't add anything. It just needs to basically meet our weighted average cost of capital of 10%, and we will consider that to be an acceptable investment. They call this the subjective approach. Many companies use it where they try to inject a dose of reality to the project analysis by saying, okay, this is high risk, therefore we're going to require a higher hurdle rate or a higher cost of capital or a return on this particular project versus another one that may have lower risk.